The SCI-Arc community finds itself situated in a freight depot in downtown Los Angeles. Having wandered in and out of the warehouses of Santa Monica and Marina del Rey and the circus tents of Merrick Street, in a physiologist's sense, SCI-Arc is a kinetic institution. Neil Denari is here tonight for two reasons. One, because of our continuing interest in his discourse on architecture. Two, because it is essential that we acknowledge Neil's role in relocating SCI-Arc in downtown Los Angeles, and as a consequence, recasting the future of the school. SCI-Arc's institutional personality was historically introverted. We shared our experiments, our imagination, and our priorities with those around the world who admired our endeavor, valued our perspective, and supported our poetic arguments. We were a closed unit of friends and colleagues. Our collective personality was hermetic. And here's an intriguing parallel. Neil Denari's discourse is similarly hermetic. These two coincident personality types remind me of Zarathustra's admonition, "Nobody tells me anything new, so I tell myself my own story." Now the paradox. The hermetic architect engenders the outward-looking institution. Arriving downtown, SCI-Arc's pedagogy now addresses the worlds of Tom Gilmore, Con Howe, Jan Perry with new premises, pressures, and responsibilities. Euphemistically, SCI-Arc now stands on the street corner talking to bankers, bond salesmen, developers, city agencies, neighborhood groups, and contractors. May I say, SCI-Arc has grown up. In a sense, the single-minded persona has become a complex personality. I'm certain this is an institutional cure, not a disease. And we must thank Neil Denari for instigating that transformation. Now to the discourse. Denari has begun to speculate not only on the sometimes insular and ethereal terms of the computer screen, but in the fragile environments of Isaac Newton and Thomas Hobbes, gravity and politics. Neil is building, and as he does so, he continues to reformulate an ideal and a vocabulary he co-owns with Jean Prouvé, Marcel Lodes, Peter Cook, and the Lloyds of Richard Rogers. The unsolved tension in the work originates in a shifting emphasis from architecture as inviolate to a form language of international commerce and advertising. From one perspective, Neil's architecture is dependent on new media, on what I would call the conceptual up-to-date. Simultaneously, the work conveys the antithesis, that is, architecture as a rarefied and independent discourse which insists that up-to-date is never really that. Again, a complex personality results. May I say that Neil Denari has grown up? Neil Denari.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for coming tonight. This lecture is, to a certain extent, a lecture about giving lectures. If someone in the audience is thinking, why do I come to a lecture? You might be thinking, am I coming for entertainment, or am I coming for explanations? If you're the sort of person who is interested in images and in architecture at times as a particular kind of distraction from the laborsome conditions of specific conditions that limit ideas, you may be looking for entertainment. If you're interested in explanations, you're interested, I suppose, in an architect presenting his work and coming clean. Explanations about the logic of the work, why you do the work. If one owns a formal language with other people, it's not about a proprietary ownership or that you say it's yours, but you must argue for it, otherwise you might have to give it up. So tonight the lecture is about function, and it's about the logic of function on the one hand that's given to us by modern architecture, called room names, codes, human factors, etc. But I also want to talk about what I call the logic of everything else, which is intuition, and many, many other human factors that go into making work. You know, about 15 years ago, I showed a project to a colleague who knew my work previously pretty well. And he looked at me and he said, you know, for the first time, this project is believable. And for the first time, this project is not simply an excuse to make form. And I said, was form so dominant in all the other projects? Was use so submerged? He said, yeah. I can tell there's no logic involved except your own sense of expression, and that's not logical. That's just pure desire. And pure desire is not a very defensible thing. Issues of mystery and wonderment somehow fill the air, but I've kind of come to believe that even though those are very passionate things, that for me it becomes even more powerful to try to offer speculations that aren't based on all bets are off. It's just an idea and I'm probably wrong. But speculations that somehow touch the axis of forms of logic that at least can be annexed into the kinds of logic that we all sort of operate off of. Money, limits, gravity, and so forth. I want to start with two references to try to establish something about these projects that I'm going to talk about. This is Wim Crouwel. He's a graphic designer. He's, I think, in his 70s at this time. He started an office in the 50s in Holland called Total Design with 5 other partners, Benno Wessing being the most well-known. And I've, for many years, been interested in Wim Crouwel's work. Total Design designed all of the graphics and the signage and the wayfinding at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. Many of you have been there, I'm sure. And you've also been to many other international airports that have undergone massive renovation, the same as Schiphol. And usually they change the graphics along with the airports. Schiphol is the only airport where they never changed the graphics, the typeface, the way in which the wayfinding system works. Crowell, being Dutch on the one hand, and his partners, found such a language to be so readable, so legible, that over time, in theory, it hadn't been improved upon. But Crowell also designed this alphabet called the Neue Alphabet. Maybe you've seen it. Maybe you've seen it in graphics from the last 10 or 15 years, album covers and so forth. You haven't really seen it as type in a book. Crowell designed it in 1967 because type was beginning to be more read on CRTs, on monitors of actually fairly low-grade quality. And he designed this font so that with the lowest grade resolution, you'd still be able to make out as it were, the letter form. And so this became a kind of, on the one hand, reductive, purposeful, minimum kind of font that probably has all of the same kinds of logic built into it as something like Helvetica does. Now, the interesting thing, of course, it's pretty evident. This is a font which seems to be visually illegible. And for me, this is a brilliant sort of possibility of taking on pragmatic conditions, limitations of the site, in this case, the computer screen, the idea of the alphabet, legibility, minimum conditions, deriving something out of it, putting it out there, and saying this was designed through these conditions. But obviously, it resonates at a level far beyond that, far beyond a level that I'm sure Crowell can himself argue for. And this remains a very important reference for me in my work. Another reference is Antonioni. The reason I did this, he says, was because it seemed to me, and of this I am convinced, that cinema today should be tied to the truth rather than to logic. Well, there's no discourse about truth any longer, and for a long time in cinema. It was washed away a long time ago with new technologies, new forms of the dismantling of time. And although neorealist cinema in post-war Italy and the theory of André Bazin and the possibility that cinema could be a truth-making device was overturned many, many times. Godard said, not a just image, just an image. Then he recanted and said, basically, cinema is a lie 24 times a second rather than the truth. But you know, truth, you think about it found in courtroom dramas and how evidence, fabrication of evidence, images, artifacts, persuasiveness, logic, illogic, is all put into a sort of rhetoric designed to make a particular kind of outcome, depending on what side you're on. Now, if I'm here to present a lecture, I'm not here to entertain in a way. I'm here to try to deliver a series of possibilities that become persuasive. If they're provisional, that's fine. If they work for longer than that, I suppose that's fine too. But we know that architecture is not a very empirical discipline. Finding truth is nearly impossible. So it's not really like a courtroom drama unless we try to kind of coerce forms of truth for ourselves, conviction, belief, etc., into logic that I can deliver to you. And that's really what the attempt is tonight in these series of projects. The first project was a project built in Tokyo in 1996. It's sort of ironic to begin a discourse on function with a project that on paper had zero function. The function had to come from me as the author of the project. It was to make an exhibition in Tokyo, and I asked him if I could build a space which would be a reference of the ideas that I was dealing with at the time and have since dealt with. And the two conditions that it could deal with on the one hand were the idea of real ground, terra firma, as it's represented here in this global map. And that terra firma articulated on the one hand by landforms and also by borders, sometimes which constantly shift. It's also based on this landscape, a landscape far more imploded at the physical level, only expressed in other and odd ways through the discourse of money and capital. But as you know, the relationship between markets and their life and their curves actually have a tremendous impact on the way in which real terra firma is either controlled or developed. After all, new land is built all the time in places like Tokyo and Holland. So with no program, I begin on treacherous ground, on ground that says I have no bathroom, I have no toilet, I have no room names, I have no human factors. There's a budget and there's a space, and then after that there's a series of logics that are indeed speculative, And I'm not sure that they become persuasive in this project, but only in the unity of all the projects to follow. Take a single surface. Have the surface become a program for the nature of terrain. It has to be abstracted. It has to be color-coded. It has to obviously fit within a particular space, or else the conditions don't, they're not acknowledged. The geometry of that surface, the coding of the surface, the colorizing of the surface all work to try to make an argument. And the argument is very hard to follow here without the backup of normative program. I'll begin to lose you very quickly because we're all pretty rational at some level, especially as architects, and you wouldn't ever make a 10-bedroom house for somebody who asked you only for 2 because your desire for size was so fantastic. So make the space work within the Euclidean envelope, but destroy it at the same time. In this surface, it's patterned after the Homolocene projection. It's a series of curvatures which are extruded across the space, which fit within the limits of the space. The space is 6.5 meters wide, 2.5 meters tall, and 11 meters long. And the geometry is very much based on the one hand of regions of ergonomics relative to the body, which we might find here, and regions which are not relative to the human body, which we find here in these kind of perverse deep sectional extrusions. The color coding refers on the one hand to nature, and at least as an American architect, to that of money. Here in the cut in the extrusions of this space are the logics of entrance, of glazing, of vision, of entrance, and of structure. Here a triangular column operates as a kind of device that allows the beam above it to be supported. We weren't allowed to anchor bolt anything into the space, so this thing is sort of sitting there as a fully heavy gravitational object in the space. The space is vaguely programmatic. The half that you're looking at here is the Rgb space, a colorized space. That space refers to the nature of projection and the CMYK separation of printing. There would be no color image projected or a color image printed without that kind of basic separation of phenomena into something readable. And so I wanted to make this space refer to that, and to a certain extent this is the media space. And in front is a kind of white space of white light, referring in fact to the surface that these images are generally printed upon. Otherwise, this space is left empty except for a series of small icons and logos referring to fictitious companies, which I wrote about at the time. I worked with Sony to develop a device called the Navicam, which you could walk around this space and with a small camera inside this focus on a small barcode, and that barcode would then allow a series of hypertext images surface, which is essentially a discourse about the nature of technology. This is designed in 1995. Built in 1996, and the discourse about the NASDAQ technology, about the univocity of technology and so forth, actually still operates, but under a completely different set of conditions given the market. Geometrically, the surface is quite simple. There's no three-dimensional curve involved. It's at this project that 2 things happened. One, the expediency of the extrusion was both a meaningful condition at the level of space. Secondly, it's also expedient at the level of construction. And it's at that moment that I limited my work, and have limited my work since then, very consciously, to the nature of the 2-dimensional curve. It's both on the one hand a kind of powerful form of simplicity that allows a slice like this to generate what for me is a very complex moment with the least amount of energy involved. The next project followed after that the next year. It was a commission that didn't get built for a house extension in the slums of Beverly Hills, below Wilshire Boulevard. Here's Wilshire. And this is in a kind of valley, a kind of depleted zone of real estate. As you can see, the context is a variety of 3- and 4-story apartment buildings. Here's the existing house in question and the site also in question. I'm standing on parking garage of a 15-story medical office building on Pico. We're looking into this as a kind of literal valley of lack of mass. The clients in their mid-60s wanted to make a project which would extend the value of the site without tearing down the house and either building a large villa, which they didn't have the money to do that, nor were they willing at that time to sell their property and move away to allow for speculators to come in. 2 grown children came back fairly frequently with small children, so the program was to make a small house detached from the existing house, 3 stories tall, maximum sort of height given the budget and the program. The bottom floor, a bedroom or office with toilet, public floor of circulation, small efficiency kitchen, living area, dining area with a deck, and the same program repeated from the 1st floor to the 3rd floor. So I was given this set of requirements, this set of conditions, and of course at that moment I laid my logic down to the client. I said, you must be willing to engage in a discourse of globalization. You must accept a continuous green envelope. The continuous green envelope here, now transposed on the one hand, neutralized perhaps as just simply a building surface to be used as wall, floor, and roof, but certainly if the discourse at a personal level was going to leave Galleria and become something workable, then here's the moment where the logic of this in terms of form reverts to certain modernist conditions and phenomenological conditions, local conditions, but it also still wants to have a discourse about the larger condition of the world. Can architecture speak to both scales, every place and a specific place at the same time? My argument is, let's say that's my desire with the work, because I'm very, very much engaged in the kind of global condition. Here, the building is lifted up off the ground to allow parking, glazing for the bottom floor, which obviously could have privacy systems, a very tiny garden which turns the corner here. The client asked that somehow the house be somewhat connected to the existing house. Facing due south, the surface is at a large aperture cut into it. That aperture allows light to come in, but itself is screened by the very same surface that's being cut out, an involution of the envelope, and only a temporal program such as passage operates at the front of the house, so no specific kind of sedentary or private activities are exposed to the front of the house. And there's the condition of sort of the interface between the private side of the house, the front south-facing side of the house, and all of this stuff working as a kind of deep brise-soleil and circulation system around the basic kitchen unit. And to the west, next to itself a 3-story house, an opaque surface which blocks out the deep western sun and also does not allow penetration visually into the house. Meanwhile, the north side with the views up to the Hollywood Hills allow a kind of glazed north side of the building. And the building doesn't emerge out of the ground per se as a kind of rhetorical device. At least I don't want that to be the reading, and that's not the logic behind it. At least not in a kind of rhetorical sense. It really came out of it from the way in which this concrete core supports the house, this becoming a shear wall for the western side of the house. The next project was in 1999. It was also not built. We were commissioned by the Ministry of Culture of France to design a project in Avignon for the Millennium Festival in Avignon. This was the largest Millennium Festival in all of Europe, and we know that there were very, very many at the time. And we were commissioned to be a part of this exhibition, which was called La Beauté, Beauty. And the curator asked 30 artists, all very well known, and 4 architects, to produce spaces of fairly large scale to explore their worlds of beauty. These are people like Richter and Anish Kapoor and so forth. And the 4 architects were kind of curious. It was myself, Peter Cook, at the beginning Ito, he didn't do it, Philippe Stark, and Gaetano Pesce. And they wanted some people who hadn't built very much, and I thought that was fantastic. And right before we were starting to work on this, I was told that I would actually be the only one to have a program. Everyone else was making projects about themselves and their world, and the curator had told me that there were politics involved, and the mayor of Avignon had agreed to have the exhibition in Avignon so long as there would be an exhibition about chess. And this person was a chess fanatic and a president of the local chess club. So I was given the program to make a space, on the one hand, for the presentation of the aesthetics and strategies of chess and Go, the Asian board game, and to make an entrance passageway into this space from the exterior of a existing concrete industrial building. Of course, you're all aware of the relationship between chess and artificial intelligence and its use over time, both from the production of automatons and so forth to here, as you see in this photograph, an early photograph of robotic, in this case, even an arm, a further extension of the computer itself, playing a sort of local grandmaster here. In relation to chess, which is arborescent, which is hierarchical, stratified and very Western, you have Go, which is absolutely horizontal, which starts out with a board that's empty, while a chess starts out with a full board. In the end, chess is about emptying the board through taking, killing, overtaking, territorializing, even though the board becomes emptier. And in the case of Go, this is about surrounding and not taking. The board goes from an empty condition to a full condition. The complete reversals and binaries and tremendous similarities of these two games, not only do they kind of outline the basic differences in philosophy of thinking between Western and Eastern forms of thought, but also forms of aggression, forms of fighting, forms of war, and so forth. And so it was really about trying to capture in this project, on the one hand, the logic or illogic or anti-logics or symmetry or provisional symmetries or binaries, all at the same time of chess and Go. This is the building that my project was to go in. There would be a space on the upper floors where chess and Go was going to be presented solely in fragments of films. I worked with the curator. We did quite a lot of research in films over time, from Russian films like Padokin and other films, American films like the Thomas Crown Affair, all the way to 2001, about the relationship of chess at the level of madness, logic, confrontation, one-on-one, etc. And we were simply then asked also to make a superstructure which would lift a person from grade up to the second floor. very simple project, a modest project, not only in scale but in intention. A project where, again, hardly any delivery of program. The curator, make a project, make it your project, make it beautiful. This is about beauty. And I could only imagine that it could be beautiful if somehow some degree of compelling logic could be found. And for me, the project is an infrastructural project. Since we were the only ones not about making our world, I tried to retire back into the nature of infrastructure itself, into simply a bridge and a passageway. The existing building that you see here, this is a void that is cut out in 3 of the floors. And we simply provided a passageway with a stair up to and ramp up to the level that the basic volume would be inside the building. On the end, this single strand is split into 2 absolutely symmetrical. One could say also that 2 strands of circulation bond into a single strand. But this moment of symmetry, of relentless sameness was very important, and the only way in which I could at that time present the idea of the binary and the same, the repetitious and the different, all at the same time. And it was also a very basic moment of needing a particular kind of program written down, a space for something. So at the end there are 2 small spaces, one for playing chess and one for playing Go, neither of which were asked for. And you could say that this part became excessive, but it also became fundamentally and obstinately a portion of the program that I needed to be able to argue, even to myself, for making the project symmetrical, at least in the front half of the project. So it's simply a passageway and a piece of infrastructure. The infrastructure splits. It's simply cut into 2. There is a destination on the one hand in each place because there are rooms there, but the intention is that these are just 2 pathways of thinking. One we might call a wet kind of thinking, something that's akin to seeing the brain as a big gelatinous mass. The other dry, seeing the brain as a kind of point-to-point system. Whether you assign one or the other to Western or Eastern might be based on your own form of logic itself. A metal panel building, steel structure cantilevered off of one large column, a beam placed in the existing opening of the building. Glazing that allows projections onto the sloping glass inside the existing building. A very, very simple kind of rendition of the project. This project is in Los Angeles. It's for LA Eyeworks. I hope you're all familiar with this company. They're, since 1979, an institution in Los Angeles. An institution is not it's not a small word here. It's a very, very precise word because their presence in the design community, their presence in the culture of Los Angeles has been very, very intense. Their first store, as many of you know, was built in 1979 in Melrose. They've had another one in South Coast Plaza since the 80s as well. Now, this is a company that did not set out to articulate identity other than through its basic forms. This logo was developed at the very inception of the company. This line was also developed at the very inception of the company, and this method of advertising was also developed at the same time. It's very rare for any company, small or large, to go forth with the same form of, at least externally oriented printed identity, as well as the stores and the spaces themselves. Meanwhile, of course, the frames change per season. So my clients were very interested in the relationship between tremendous stability and on the one hand of architecture, and on the other hand the speed of a culture of fashion and design which is inherent in its mobility. The site is on Beverly and Martell, south of Hollywood. This is a bowstring truss building that encompasses 6 stores. We're on the corner here. The trusses are running east and west, and we have about 1,150 square feet. Now, the mandates to me were actually very simple on very pragmatic points of view. Number one, the front of the store has to be completely transparent. We need to let people see in when they're walking by. We need to let them see in when they're driving by, and especially at night, to let people also see in. Number two, there are 600 pairs of glasses, 100 individual designs with 6 colors each. Every pair had to be displayed, and every pair had to be able to be accessible by virtually anybody walking into the store. So this wasn't meant to be a program for a boutique where everything would be behind glass, or you'd show images of the product and have to sort of go behind the desk and get a demo or something. So the store is very much about the idea of the person feeling comfortable in the space and feeling accessible to all of the glasses. That's the basic zoning condition to the project, which essentially led to the design. There are many other kind of micro-specific, very, very specific programmatic concerns, as you can imagine in a store, from many ergonomic conditions involving height ranges, views across the space to be able to see product and so forth. But in a way, the architecture was about finding its place, getting out of the way, and doing its job on a very, very local level. The plan is very straightforward. Obviously, the sales space in front, offices and storage in the back. The sales desk found itself here in relation to the glasses as a kind of panoptic condition. As I said before, all the glasses had to be within reach. They also had to be absolutely within view so that theft could be deterred. So the glasses could not be facing out behind opaque surfaces. They couldn't be suspended, etc. And we did even try to get around this basic logic, but given the mathematics of 600 pairs of glasses and some of the programs of the wall surfaces, we deployed the glasses here, and then we get into micro programmatic conditions in the store. I should just go back and point out one thing. The canopy, which is suspended in this space, is supported on a 14-inch steel deep beam with a steel column hidden in this wall, a 3-inch steel column hidden in aluminum surrounds in the storefront with steel framing to demising wall here. This project, in that sense, given the kind of zoning parameters, 100% transparency, accessibility of the glasses, conditions of the furniture, which I will talk about. The architecture designed itself. It went to the places that it could go. The canopy, which is absolutely an extension of the interior of the space, forming signage and so forth, actually defied the building department's description of either an awning or a canopy. And it actually sat in the building department for some time as they tried to figure out where this project was. And we managed to reinvent in a very small way some of the conditions that wouldn't typically allow this to be projected as far away from the facade as it is. And there's a picture of the steel beam being lifted into place onto this column. There are 2 columns on either side of the doorway. The geometry of the project obviously comes on the one hand from the Gallery Ma project to try to continue the conversation about continuity. It takes specific conditions into play quite obviously. A more compressed zone in the front of the store, an 8-foot soffit, smoothing out turbulently into a 10-foot soffit, That corresponds to the way in which the ergonomics of the furniture is used. The front of the store is about the dialogue with the public, something that's very, very important to LA Eyeworks. A surface which is not parallel to the glazing but perpendicular to the glazing, articulating a micro-zone of entrance which doesn't defy the mandate of transparency in the front facade. The continuation of the canopy moving out to use in a kind of a Keto effect the curvature of the bullnose of the space, so that the orthogonal, the very fundamental orthogonal condition of the blue envelope works dynamically against the bullnose of the building. We offered this as a programmatic element to the clients. Maybe Eric was right. Maybe the media is quite important to me. We offered it as a way to allow the clients to offer their forms of media, their forms of rhetoric, their forms of advertising and humor to the culture passing by without having to imprint it definitively. So the LED is just simply inserted in here. We were actually challenged at the very beginning that this technology might be trendy, might be something about a particular kind of momentary fascination. And while you see LEDs quite often out there in higher-end interiors, that's great. And we just sort of saw it as being the most ubiquitous form of technology. It's actually not very expensive. It doesn't break down. It's easy to program and change. And it's sort of understood as infrastructure itself. And that's all we were going for here. Not actually anything decorative, but something very, very performative. These brilliant panorama photographs by Benny Chan. This is drywall, this is MDF, this is steel framing with stucco, this is elastomeric paint, this is flat paint, this is high gloss polyurethane paint. Every surface was made out of a different material based on the logic of use. The exterior use, pretty clear. This is more or less a piece of furniture which people will touch, and things will be placed on here, so we needed a tough, durable surface. Drywall, flat, to allow any imperfections to go away in a surface that no one will touch. The furniture became a project in and of itself, an intense project based on a kind of growing degree of kind of microscopic control of the program of the furniture. Furniture can break apart as you see during the day, but it also goes together as a kind of Chinese puzzle. We were not asked to do this. We gave it as a piece of the program. We suggested that if the furniture could be put together as a kind of curious assemblage at night from time to time, one could use it as a kind of internal landscape to allow mannequins splayed with glasses and so forth at night to, on the one hand, build up a kind of identity through the material itself, not through the logo, not through the graphics. And at the same time that we gave ourselves this program, it also helped supply specific conditions such as an intersection of a bench into a piece of polycarbonate, which acts in tension in this piece, which is a display cabinet. This is folded 3 millimeter thick stainless steel. This hole allows the material to become lighter like a slotted beam. The surface here of the dispensing table is also built up into 3 different zones of program. Inside this piece of the furniture, there's a laptop which is taken out to work with the customer when they're purchasing their glasses. It sits within this small 1-inch depression. Otherwise, the rest of the surface is about the interface between the person buying and the person working in the store. And the upper surface is about a coat rack, a place to put books or coffee, etc. So the surface is actually determined on the one hand by these local pragmatic conditions, but the elevations of all of these things connect, and I'll just go back, they connect to the various other elements that allow this landscape to become itself continuous. So some of the specific tectonic things were a merger between the logic of the equation of the whole piece and the inherent piece itself in terms of the program. After we proposed a vacuum-formed grid on the wall, Jim Iserman was suggested to us to work on the project by the clients. We were familiar with his work in 2 dimensions and hadn't yet seen his vacuum-formed work, which was happening at the time in Site Santa Fe and in other places. And we gave him this site on the west wall of the store with the provisions only to allow within the grid the shelving for the glasses. So you see this 59 panel grid designed by Jim as a kind of reference to the tectonics and the geometry of the architecture itself. These were some of the pieces that he was working on at the time. This was presented in Richard Tellis in summer of 2001, and was also built in silver in Site Santa Fe later on. And so here's an image of Jim's installation, which has an incredibly seamless relationship to the coloration and to the geometry of the store itself. The next project was a project done in 2001, a concept project that we were asked to produce through a consortium of clients for Japan. We were asked to design by a very large Japanese technology company that starts with an S. I'm not allowed to actually present this project, but I'm doing it anyway. Along with 2 other advertising companies, one is Hakuhodo, which is a very large advertising company. This large company, technology company, like everyone else rethinking their place in the market, had slipped at the level of brand recognition and needed a strategy to try to regain that position. The strategy was to try to develop a kind of worldwide global sub-brand of products that would, of course, attach to it a tremendous sort of cultural identity, a sort of high-end identity that would allow the lower zones and the mid-range zones of the products of the company to become more desirable. This range of products would only be affordable to 0.001 of the population. The concept, and it was thought about by a whole series of people, which was to design a hotel as a kind of concept that could be deployed around the world in major cities, stores to sell the products, websites, and objects themselves. We were asked actually to design all of those. And while that sounds pretty exciting, we just kind of said, okay, let's design the hotel, and we'll write a brief about that hotel and also the store, of which I won't show you the store tonight. The brief for the hotel was 80 rooms, actually on a fairly large urban site, prototypical in Japan. The idea of exclusivity, the idea of a kind of sense of mystery, obviously status, some things which actually articulate divisions in class structure and economies, which sometimes are incredibly problematic, makes one sort of cynical. We tried to just concentrate on the way in which the architecture would perform that sort of service in that condition vis-a-vis the hotel. Here's the image that probably many of you know of the Atlanta Hyatt Regency by Andreas Gursky, the first atrium hotel by Portman and also in the United States. Now, the one thing you'll hardly ever see in Tokyo is an atrium. Why? You can't afford to build one. The only thing you can afford to build in Tokyo is floor plate. land costs so much that to create void is generally not possible. Yes, there are some hotels, Akasaka Prince has a bit of an atrium and so forth, but largely, while there are a dime a dozen in office buildings in Orange County or in hotels all across North America, they're not found there. Portman, I'm assuming, developed the concept of the atrium as an extension of urban life, as a sort of sublime inverted void. Everybody has the same experience. You walk out of your room and you're there. It's a sort of one-dimensional experience. I suppose you charge for the void. And I think in hotels, and the one we propose, you're definitely charging for the void, and I'll show you why. Here's a building that takes the atrium and basically turns it inside out like a rag and squeezes it out to the city. The hotel is about a certain sense of inaccessibility on the one hand. It's about the maximum level of identity on the other through the geometry and through the forms. And it's also about trying to produce a sort of sense of urban space, which on the one hand, like a Zen garden, you can see, but you can't go into. If you took this block, which is 68 by 54 meters, and you extruded out the building with 3 meters per floor, which is a little bit low, the number of floor plates that you see here is the floor plate not being built in this site. The very condition of ridding the site of that floor plate is the first moment of unbelievability, also about making the hotel much, much more of a kind of island within an urban condition itself. Each one of these things is like a vertical island. You know, some of the most extreme hotels, the most expensive ones, are generally found on islands like Phuket. $3,000 a night, your own swimming pool, vast amount of space and so forth. But how to generate that condition really in a city like Tokyo, where you can't on the one hand afford to build 80 rooms at 200 square meters each, but rooms that are more like 50 square meters. And yet at the same time produce a certain sense of singularity, a certain sense of exclusivity. These towers only have a quarter of the rooms in each one of them, and as you'll see in the floor plates, the condition of the few number of rooms in each tower. Here's the store that will sell these high-end products, one to be installed into the hotel. These very large cores come down in each bay, which is 17 meters across. Very large concrete walls go all the way up for shear and for cantilever at the top. Cinemas, restaurant, bars, spa, swimming pool, etc. On the one hand, a somewhat normative program for the base. We have parking and utilities and so forth on the ground floor, and below nightclub. Here are the sections that show the relationship between the vertical cores, the stair cores and elevator cores that go up through these sections. And in the lower parts of these towers, just 2 floors on a level, the occupancy is so small that it would allow for only a single stair. And a kind of collapsing of all of these elevations. This follows some of the self-similarity of design one bay, and you've got the concept, at least tectonically, that allows shifts to occur across the site to generate a degree of misregistration so that these guys aren't looking at hardly anyone else in the hotel, where you've got a kind of condition of rooms looking across to one another. New forms of windows are offered into the space. You can enter into the showroom on grade here, into the first bay of the building, and in the third bay of the building, this is the entrance to the hotel. The next project is in design development and will be constructed beginning in the spring of 2003. It's a house renovation and addition in Mount Washington in Los Angeles, northeast of downtown, in between Eagle Rock and Pasadena and so forth. This house was constructed in 1977, a wood frame gable roof house. Very straightforward, on a fantastic site that has absolutely sweeping views of downtown, all the way out to Pasadena and beyond. The garage fronts the street, so we'll be renovating the garage and the existing house. You see some of the conditions of the neighbors here. This is as it is when the clients moved in. The clients moved from Chicago, obviously a tremendously different climate, super cold in the winter and incredibly hot and humid in the summertime, and looking forward to taking advantage of the nature of inside and outside, and also the dramatic views to be afforded if one goes up. So the program is about a basic renovation of the first floor of the house and building a new public space on the second floor. This is the existing condition in the front half of the house. It's sort of like a two-bay wide house. The front part of the gable is absolutely open, except for this kitchen, and the rear part of the house is got bedrooms in it. Now the clients are a very compelling duo. The wife is a fashion stylist and formerly a designer of great repute in the culture. And this is her work, and these are the kinds of things that she deals with. She deals with fashion on absolutely every level imaginable, from the way in which material, forms, details go together, and has to do it on a variety of levels and with a variety of ways. And as you know, editorial photography has themes and so forth behind it. The husband is a craftsman, a fine woodworker, who will also be involved in building the house himself as both a craftsman and contractor. And so the relationship between detail, between craft, between style and form is absolutely at work in this project. At the same time, it's very modest and very straightforward at the same time. Lower drawing is the existing plan of the house. As I said, it's sort of 2 bays wide, master bedroom with toilet, a second toilet, a convertible bedroom with a sliding panel here, fireplace, and the kitchen. We're working with the simplicity of the construction and the geometry as much as possible, and you can see on the top drawing, we're simply taking away 1/4 of the roof. This part of the roof is taken away for 2 reasons. One, to leave the kitchen where it is for economy, for plumbing and utilities. And number 2, that specific corner, after sitting on the roof at night for quite some time and really being very, very specific about the location, potentially of couches, chairs, heights of things, that will capture the best views to the project. So it's a very, very simple project. We're making a connection to the master bedroom, to the master bathroom, and renovating all of this. New kitchen in the same place, the dining here, and what we're working on mostly is a stair. We're trying to up the ante on the stair builder, the craftsman, and have him build an incredibly beautiful piece that gets you from the ground floor up to essentially this volume of public space up above. It's facing due south, and we've raised the front facade of the garage along with green surface to be able to, on the one hand, articulate a kind of private space while at the same time preserving views that are actually incredibly dramatic. Even on the lower floor, you can see the new kitchen beyond and some of the earlier iterations. The mandate was to make the front lower front of the house all glass, so we come in with a moment frame, a very basic moment frame, on top of which is wood construction that the floor of the main addition sits on. Two Y split columns go up from columns here next to a new front door, which is moved from this bay to this bay, which is also operating inside this wall, which is hidden. We're working off of the existing footprint line of the house because we can't build further to the west. Everything sort of falls out based on the parameters. We're using a slot between the existing house and the new addition as a kind of glazed reveal between this new space and the roof form of the existing house. But the roof of the house obviously comes down to this line, so this becomes a kind of in-between space of both connection and a kind of reveal. And here you see the top of a multi-purpose piece of furniture, Stair, that will mark the division between the existing and the new. Obviously, it's facing due south, so we're working on issues of sun control and also materials at the moment. The line of the addition must follow exactly the same line as the existing line of the house. Steel columns come down here and here with shear bracing inside. That works with this moment frame here. The main structure sitting on top of that. The Y structure sitting inside this wall, which is, at this point is alternately opaque green glass with silk-screened surfaces of grass itself, making this kind of striped pattern. We're also possibly thinking about reflective glass for the angry neighbor who himself can look into his own life rather than scorn his next-door neighbors. The other ambition, at least now, is to try to generate a dimension of 3 inches or less on this corner by sloping the wall and roof construction to get the purest elevation in this screen, which will be motorized and allow, obviously, one to close it down to make it like a louver as it is here, or to raise it up completely to deal with the sun control. The glass is situated deeply behind it. The mandate was to make a design with the maximum amount of glazing possible to the south and to the east. The only way to achieve this, of course, is to hide it deep within the envelope of the house itself. We are exposing it to a certain extent more on the east. Although this may turn the corner, we're trying to think of this as a very basic kind of blind system to be raised and lowered for use during the day. We're also looking possibly at folded perforated curtains. We're most interested in how this very basic building volume and building envelope as an expedient system of construction as a result of the limitations of the setback and the zoning and the inherent construction of the house. This surface, which obviously becomes the stair, a fragmented partition between the kitchen and the dining. It also acts as a balustrade and handrail and bookshelf and place to put the television set and so forth on the upper levels. It will be manufactured in probably a variety of materials, all to achieve this particular kind of surface, from steel framing, larger steel framing inside of it, as well as steel framing for the exposed part of the stairs that goes from the middle landing. And there you see it simply in the space. This space is left alone and essentially cleared out. The sliding glazing here looking south, and this piece acting as a kind of very specific, ergonomically, programmatically determined. This actually slices down as well, so that when you're standing up here, if we actually pulled this all the way across. The relationship between this line and the slice of the ceiling would actually allow a view into the lower part of the space. So we've sort of made an ergonomic cut in this piece as well. The next project was proposed for New York. It won't be built either. It was a project which suffered from, like many other projects in New York, from 9/11. It was our biggest project and our most ambitious project, simultaneously expansive and limited all at the same time. Union Square, many of you who know New York well also know the life of Union Square. It's changed from the 70s and 80s, from being a fairly scruffy place to now a tremendously redeveloped place all around the park. There's new forms of commercial, some of it not very well done, and a slot right here, 28 feet wide, that since 1988 my client had been attempting to purchase from the owner. The client is a developer in his early 50s who was coming out of real estate into development and had his eye on this project, as I said, for a long time, and had finally gotten hold of the site and was in escrow on the site. He was somebody who's interested very much in trying to make a building that obviously worked within the budget, a budget of $270 a foot, and something of great significance on the one hand as well, trying to get past the expedient nature of developer projects. Here's a view standing on the building adjacent, looking south obviously to the skyline. This was taken in April of 2001. And this is on the same building next door, looking to the north now to the Empire State Building, the tallest building in New York. And here's the site. In the 1930s, a fire destroyed a 15-story building on this site. And for some reason, we still couldn't track it down. Only this was built back in its place. The structural engineer did analysis with the developer since 1988 to actually analyze the substructure, at which they agreed it would sustain another 15-story building with very, very little change to it. Now, the thing about this project is it was all predetermined. The section is completely predetermined and was essentially given to me by the developer. A ground floor that goes from 17th to 18th Street is the ground floor lease space. Up above the project is one loft per floor based on a 125-foot street wall for Union Square, a 1 to 2.5 setback, with a limitation of 40,000 feet of FAR on the site, 5,000 feet here, 35,000 feet here. The existing buildings come up to here and here respectively, so that means these units are actually looking sort of through a tunnel on the one hand. All of the FAR is pushed to the south. The lower floors have the highest floor-to-floor height from 18 feet here, 12 feet here, and shrinking down to 10 feet here. So in essence, it's the attempt to push as many units as possible up above the existing buildings to generate panoramic views for the units. Now, it became very clear, given this and given the way in which the core would work and so forth, that the project was simply going to be about the envelope and to a certain extent specking out certain things on the interiors. Concrete, floors, it was all going to be about the envelope. And after doing some research and kind of culling in my memory, I remembered that the building next door, right next door, was Andy Warhol's second factory, not his first, but his second one. It was in 1968 that he was shot there, and this is a photograph taken of Warhol after that time, after they had discovered this sort of portrait made by an art student out of tape. And Andy, obviously so much into the nature of repetition, sat in this window looking out to Union Square from the factory and had his face imitate the image itself, reiterating the theme of repetition. He also made this piece around the same time, and it drove home very, very clearly. I would make the project in the envelope my own story, my own sort of archaeology about my reading of Union Square, and it would be a powerful one, and I would sell it to the client. And I would have to do that because really by the time the expedient nature of the program was already delivered, what was left for me? And if one says the envelope is left for you, then you finally become fixated on the idea of what can you do within 10 inches, what can you do within a certain amount of money, and what can you do to try to pull along the logic of everything else. And here's where the logic of everything else, like an articulated secret history of Union Square, gets played out. I began listening to the Velvet Underground obsessively, which actually I usually do anyway, so it was just more. And in Run, 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 Lou Reed intones, "Gonna take a walk down to Union Square. You never know who you're gonna find there." And I was very certain then that this was really, you know, I know it's sort of a bit about the Kennedy and Lincoln stuff, but, you know, and they were each on the same place at the same time and 100 years apart. But it was something powerful because this was me projecting my sense of culture into the project. And after all, isn't that what we're supposed to do? So it became about the pixel and about the dot screen and the color separation. And this is what the project was at various levels, from hot dogs on a kind of staggered level to faded hot dogs to smaller hot dogs in gold anodized aluminum to circles with a bigger dot screen being drawn obsessively in AutoCAD, all the way to taking Warhol's face himself, and I was positive that this would be the project that we would take to the client. But, you know, I couldn't do it. It was too personal. It was too much of a story. It was too overly poetic, too humorous. And maybe you might say, you missed it. You should have pushed for that one. That didn't become interesting to me because I didn't think, in my own mind, it was part of the logic of everything else. It was a kind of folly. What we were dealing with was simply the issue of repetition, so how could I continue the story of Warhol? And the story of Warhol was absolutely just about repetition, which is involved in a $275 a square foot building, a curtain wall which absolutely becomes something based on the repetitious nature of it, and the possibility of dealing with the graphic that could be just simply a form of mathematical logic. So we started studying patterns of all kinds based on one condition: 3 lines in a 6-foot square of glass that enter from each side, that find themselves meandering and changing based on the way in which they're connected and disconnected. We looked at the way in which they can be rotated both in plan and in section, and the way in which they could be color-coded. It became very much an infinite kind of thing, and in that sense it was very successful. And so we tried to find the pattern that we liked with the right amount of sun control, the right amount of opacity, because we can't have operable windows on the party walls, as well as something that could be done with the least number of different sheets of glass. So we went through all of these, some of them which had 36 different pieces of glass, and this one is 4 pieces to produce the final scheme. So the final scheme is an accordion folded surface on the west side, hybrid accordion fold on the east side, and as you'll see, a very straight, flush line of glass where the structural core and the circulation core comes down. Here it is in relation to the existing context, fully maxed out on the FAR. These buildings are already maxed out on the FAR, so unless they were to be torn down and a similar project put up, however unlikely, the developer sort of felt very good that this project would be able to sell apartments with panorama views above 125 feet. The ground floor plan, very expedient. It virtually designs itself. Here's the core to get into the towers above, and toilets for the two stores. The core is set against the edge of the building with scissor stairs that allow exit doors as far apart as possible, the elevators and so forth. This also displaced to the edge of the site and the edge of the building the kitchen and toilet cores on the larger, lower units themselves. Very, very simple building. Obviously, it had to be simple and very cheap on the one hand. A winter garden of 2 lines of glazing, both operable at the front of the building. A 1 bay wide flat slab structure with columns that behave according to the condition of the envelope around them. Here, of course, we have party wall condition below and exposed superstructure up above, and the vertical kind of cantilever of the stair core. The smaller units up above step back because of the slope. More or less the same project, just simply less square footage, mitigated on the one hand positively by the fact that they can be sold for more per square foot because of the location at the top of the tower. A section of the dual glazing winter garden, and a green roof at the top to be used by all of the inhabitants. The final project is a competition that we did in 2001 and beginning of 2002 for Japan. The subject of this competition was Tomohiro Hoshino, a national hero, a national figure in Japan. In 1970, as a gymnastics teacher, he became paralyzed after a fall, fell on his head, and spent 9 years in the hospital from 1970 to 1979. In 1972, when one of the young boys who was staying in the hospital near him asked to have everyone sign a tennis hat, Hoshino tried desperately to put a pen in his mouth and write his name on the hat. And at that moment, he felt so sad, not about his physical state, but about his inability to express other emotions of other kinds, that he then set out to teach himself how to paint illustrations of flowers and to write poetry about the simple things in life. And here's a photograph of him in the hospital. He lives in Japan. He's now married. And there's an existing museum here in Azumamura, which is a tiny village of 4,000 people north of Tokyo in Gunma Prefecture. It's a very beautiful prefecture. The countryside is fantastic. It's green. The snow is wonderful in the wintertime. And it was a site that was very large. One could have built on either side of this small mountain road on an incredibly thick, steeply sloping site. You can see the density of this forest. This was really the only buildable area to work on. You could not use the site presently occupied by the existing building, so it meant that the museum couldn't be designed for this spot, i.e. a building torn down and then built later. You would have to imagine that this would be in use. So we simply took up the logical place on this peninsula next to the lake formed by a dam. You know, I worked on this project in a way that I don't usually, and that is finding inspiration on the one hand in the program and in the specifics of the program and in the story of this person. It's not a museum for many people for a changing collection, but for one person, a very specific story. And if you couldn't become precise about articulating that, then I'm sure that the project couldn't be very powerful. And so I guess resorting to convention that we all do, we find forms and we find, I suppose, meaning in those forms. Here, the brush, the flower, folding in the context of the river to produce the plan. Not literally, but you can kind of see this merge, and it's an acknowledgement of these phenomena that articulate the subject matter and the person involved. This project was about a series of journeys and a series of pathways, some of which we choose and some of which we don't choose. Obviously, Tomohiro experienced at least one that he didn't, and how to articulate those things that we can choose and we don't choose. And that mirrors, to a certain extent, the way in which we move through museums, sometimes based on choice and sometimes based on strict circuitry. So the project was how to articulate in poetic terms a series of pathways that were about movements that are also limited by site conditions, by other things like money and so forth, but which are poetically ended, but ended in a way that still allows movement and continuity and the journey to sort of flow along. Parking is here on 2 levels. You pass down a ramp into the space, 1.5 meters down into this lobby space. You can see the backup. There's video and exhibition space, but more importantly, it's the relationship between this lobby, the exterior of the views out across the lake, and the moment where the choices about how one will enter these pathways, about how one will move across these pathways at various micro levels, despite the fact that these forms are very, very much linear. The scale of them at an ergonomic and a body level actually defies that. They float above a winter garden. The program asked that flowers and trees be planted during different times of the season. So we put this winter garden in for these pathways to float above. You go down to -1.5, you go back up to 0 into the main gallery spaces, or down another 1.5 meters into the winter gardens. Entrance into the front of the building. And so this is the moment where the molding of these pathways becomes an imprinted condition in the ceiling surface, melting into nothingness, melting into a kind of horizontality. A series of choices of movement of pathways, from ramps up, stairs up, doors out below these pathways into the winter garden. Here's a view in the exhibition area. There are 100 pieces, almost all the same size, presented out of the 300 that Tomohiro has painted. And a view in the winter garden. This is all gravel that one can plant flowers and trees, glazed roofs with openings in the roof so that the light and air can come in between these pieces. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'll take any questions if you have any. Thank you.
how the simulation of the side of the Manhattan project emerged and how that's become, projects have become more about discrete entities that somehow fit together with common shapes rather than the universal or global kind of surface and language that was at the beginning of your project and the early project and so on. And I wonder how you respond to this kind of disappointment maybe.
There's no disappointment. I hope I didn't register that at all. So that's the first thing. The second thing, the giving the lecture, when you give a lecture, I articulated the idea of explanations. When you design your work and you think about your work, you make choices. If you haven't articulated something logically, you might move on, you might get stuck. But to actually spend time to ask you all to come here to listen to me, I made the choice to try to give explanations for why and what's behind the work. So when I say it's about a lecture about giving lectures, what I mean it's about a lecture in which the content of any lecture should be about articulating to a certain extent why one does something, not that simply you own it or you call it, your own. So I'm sorry if I threw you off, but that was what the argument there was. I'm not sure I completely understood your question after that, except to say that if the work is becoming more fragmented or not as sort of signature-like, and maybe if you rephrase it for me, I'll be able to answer it.
No, I was interested in the transition from the other projects, and then kind of interested in where the file came from in the Manhattan project, apart from the fact that it was next to the soap box and where the Warhol was in the project next door. If there was a way that your work conceptually transitioned into that.
No, well, the tile came, first of all, that to make a glass building, you've got a sheet, and they're largely repetitive. So whether it had an image on it or not, it was a technical system to deal with. The second thing is I didn't have very much dimension to work with for sun control, and I was trying to work without having to, do the Mies thing and force everybody to have white curtains and so forth. We couldn't have any operable windows, only operable on the north and the south. So there had to be a certain amount of opacity without reverting to an opaque surface with punched windows in it, which is what we designed at the very beginning to try to deal with sun control. As I said, after thinking about the project more and the kind of ambitions of the secret history of Union Square, of which I suppose I could have continued on with the project, talked to the client, said, here's a particular story I would like to tell through the work. There's resonance and meaning. Warhol was an important figure in art and in New York, et cetera, et cetera. A little bit the way Libeskind kind of developed the Jewish Museum, from the found text of Abraham and Moses and Walter Benjamin's address, and his own recollection on the one hand of Berlin. In this one moment I was trying to do that, but I stopped short of doing it because that's not really how I operate as an architect. So what I could take out of it was the one thing that seemed to be logical, and that was the relationship between a window, in the case of the patterns developed after that, which became a dot in reverse, knocked out of more or less an opaque surface. So the tile was there as a transition to dealing with sun control and the logic of the project, and then the struggle to try to deal with repetitiousness in a graphical system which hits a kind of non-narrative moment. The pattern doesn't refer to anything other than the geometric logic of itself, and not telling another story. So whether or not there needs to be more rhetoric in the tile or the panel, I don't know. I wanted to take it out. I wanted to drain it of that and just use the material and the conditions that I had discovered to get that far. No, we present what we work with, which is, I mean, to a certain extent, the Mount Washington project is an in-process, project. The renderings are, they weren't degraded really, but they were, not specific and not finished. We do a lot of schemes, whether for the larger project or for very specific sorts of conditions. We generally set the camera from the views of the occupant. We work in animations as well. And the comfort level for me personally, and with the few people that I work with the computer is so high that we're able to communicate. I didn't say that it's always easy, because these images are loaded on the one hand with the psychology of specificity that a white cardboard model doesn't. I choose to communicate in the greatest degree of aspiration toward understanding what the project will be, because people are paying for it. They want to feel the project. These are the ways in which we work from the very beginning. And it's only a rendering, and we delete it if it's no good, and we move on, and we make many iterations. And it's not something consciously about not building physical models. We just don't do very much of that. There's no ideology about it. And I know that we're in the minority, but the comfort level and the ability, and also a certain sense of resistance, because we don't really play with the software, and we don't play with Photoshop, and we don't use zoom lenses, and so we resist a lot of things that other architects use as creative subject matter. And I guess in the end what it really says is, I could care less about drawings, always have, and I've only cared about designing. Okay, thank you very much.